My name is Evan Kuster, and I'm here to talk to you about how to texture parts using Rhino, ZBrush, and Magix for this workflow. So the first thing I do is I import the part into Rhino, and then I explode it so that I can select all of these surfaces. So I'm going to go in here and select all the surfaces that I want to put a texture on. I got to make sure at this point I select all of the surface that I want. And then make sure I don't miss anything. That looks good. Once I've got them selected, I join them all together. And then I offset them inwards just a little bit. In this case, 0.2 millimeters. And this is so I have an object so that I can texture later, rather than trying to mask out exactly on the part what I want. So what I'm left with is basically that. And then let me hide everything else. And this, I forgot a little part here. Let me add that back in real quick. This part has a lot of tiny little pieces on it. So join, offset surface, inwards, because I'm not trying to change the exterior diameter or like the exterior profile of the part. Everything goes to the inside. All right, now let me just double check that. Hiding everything. That looks pretty good. All right, so now that I got this, I export it out. We're going to call this number 5, and I'm exporting that as an STL. And I'm using these particular polygon settings in order to have a very kind of high resolution, but not insanely high resolution poly count on this part, because I'm going to be using that poly count, exactly that poly count, to basically texture the object. I'm going to hit OK. Export that out. Go to ZBrush. Let me open up a new ZBrush. All right, so this is brand new ZBrush. Going to go and import. Sorry, the STLs get imported through the Z plugin. Then you go to 3D Print Exporter. So click on 3D Print Exporter and then down to STL Import. And I'm going to go click on number 5. All right, so now, and then you click and drag to drag it into ZBrush. You go up here and hit Edit at the top, or you can hit the letter T on the keyboard. I'm going to hit F to center it on the screen. And then you can hold Shift to lock it into position. So I'm going to try and lock it into the right position that I can see it well. There we go. So now that it's here, I'm basically going to go, I like expanding this little side window here, and I'll basically get rid of this materials window by just clicking on that little symbol and dragging it out, opening up alphas, dragging the alpha in here. And so your alphas are what are we going to use as basically the base texture. So I'm going to go and import. I'm going to import our PNG, which is the leather sample that we got earlier. It can be any JPEG or PNG or bump map or any of these things. So I'm going to import that in. You can see it previewed here. If I hover over it, you can kind of see it previewed there. So now that that's there, I have a couple of different things I can do to this. One is so this is how dense the mesh is there. It's currently 217,000 points. I might actually go to the geometry tab and then divide that once more. So now it's 1.3, just for the more polys the better for texturing. So now we've got my alpha here and the texture set to it. The brush is the standard brush. Now there's a couple of ways I can apply textures to this object. I can either just use the default kind of dot stroke and I can draw textures all over it. But as you can see, that doesn't look great. And so a lot of times you can actually so I hit the S key to bring up the draw size command. I'm going to make it much bigger, and I'm going to take my focal shift all the way out to the line. That basically is the blur. If you can imagine like kind of a blur on the edge of a tool in Photoshop or something, that's the same thing. I just made basically so there's no blur. So I can drag those over the object. Again, that's okay. That's not really what I'm looking for though. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go change the stroke to this rectangular drag command. And then now you can drag it out a little bit easier. And so, but again, it's still a little intense. Like I don't need that serious of a bump. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to turn my Z intensity down to like 6. And it just varies depending on the part and the texture you're using and the poly count. So I can't give you a specific rule. And so now that that's there, I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and I'm just going to drag this texture over the object. That's okay, and you kind of have to click and drag. It's definitely not a science at this point that applies very easily, or at least I don't quite know how to do it perfectly. Let me click and drag again. But you see those seams that are showing up there? I don't want that. So I'm going to go, how did I fix that? I think you go to modify, no, you click on surface. And so now, if I do that, I won't have those seams when I drag them over. They kind of just get hidden. And so now you can see it's textured over a lot of the part, but on some areas it's kind of getting stretched. It is just protection. And so to fix those areas, I'll go in, change my brush back to the freehand brush, and then just kind of like paint over some of the more problematic areas, some of the more difficult ones. You can zoom in, look at the corners on things. Just kind of paint that all in there. Get the front side. And you can change the texture size by changing your brush size. So the bigger the brush, the bigger the texture for the most part. And so, yeah, that's basically it. You can maybe like brush over the whole thing, add some more texture in there if you want. All right, so now that we've got it, and it doesn't really matter about the inside because we'll just boolean that off later. And so now that I've got this texture and you can be happy with it or not, I'm going to go, and because we're at 1.3 million points, it's going to be a little heavy. So I'm going to go in, hit Z plugin, go to the decimation master, and hit preprocess current. This will take a few seconds to load because of the file size that we've just created, but it'll go pretty quickly. Computing, please wait. All right, maybe a little bit longer, but normally it goes pretty quickly. Probably under a minute at most, maybe 2. All right, now that it's done processing, I'm going to go to Z plugin again, hit decimate current, and that'll take the poly count way down from 1.3 to 261,000. If you zoom in really close, you can see it's now, you can see the polys there. The resolution isn't quite as nice just because there's so much data contained inside of a texture, but it's good enough for most of these things. And at the end of the day, you won't be able to notice. And so I'm going to go ahead and export that out. We'll call that 4.1. And it exports out as an OBJ. So then the next step is I'm going to go open up Magix, bring in, where's my file? Bring in 4.1. And then I'm also going to go back. So where is it? There you go. Now that's in Magix. One of the things I'm also going to do is I'm going to go back to, let me just get that, stop that from blinking. I'll go back to Rhino. Click on here. Now I want to back up. I should have done this earlier, so I'm just going to back up and do this. So I'm going to take this surface, which is, yeah, I want it just as a surface, and I'm going to offset it inwards a little tiny bit by 0.1 millimeters. And I'll show you why I'm doing this, and I'm going to export that out as well. That I'm going to use as a Boolean later in Magix, and I'll show you why it's important when I get there. So I'm going to export that out. We're going to call that Boolean 2. So now in Magix, I can go and I can drag in my my part, my Lantos part. And so here we go. I'm going to take that. I think that's the one that I want. That'll load in. Nope, loaded. I must have moved it. So let me just export it out of Rhino real quick so we know it's in the same spot. Awesome, thank you. So I'm going to export out this whole part. I'm going to call it object 1. And I'm going to import this into Magix. Let me just go grab object 1. Import that in. They should overlay on top of each other. So perfect. So now we've got your part with a texture on the outside. Now, but the problem is if you zoom in really close, you can see this. It's really hard to see with my mouse, but the area that I'm tracing is actually the underlying part sticking through the textured part. So if I turn off the texture, we've got this going on, nice and smooth part. If I turn on the texture, it looks better on the corner. So you see how it's not the original part is kind of poking through the texture. If I turn off the original part, like that's the difference you're getting. And so that's why I wanted to bring in that earlier Boolean part. So let me go in, I'm gonna go and grab my other Boolean part, Boolean 2, drag that in. And so now we've got multiple textures in the same location. So I'm gonna hide my textured part. And do you see how we have that exterior surface between my Boolean part and my final part is overlaid? When you subtract the two together like this, you'll get a bunch of weird geometry that's not wonderful. And so my workaround for that is I basically go in, select the exterior surface of my Boolean part. Why didn't that select? And then I offset that out by, let's say, 0.1, just enough that it's so they're not in exactly the same location anymore. All right, and then now I take these two objects and I Boolean them together. So subtract green from red in this case. No, I don't want to save an original part. So now we've got this little lip that runs around the outside, like right, it's slightly smaller, which is just enough space for our textures to fit in there. And so now that the textures are perfectly overlaid, it's very simple. You just go Boolean unite, click OK, and then they should fuse together perfectly. A lot of times I'll go and then fix it after this, but that's totally up to you. And that's basically how you texture parts using this particular workflow. Though there are many other ways of doing that, that's the way that I found that kind of works the best, because it preserves all of the internal geometries without having to bring it into ZBrush and Dynameshing it. So all of these internal geometries are still nice and crisp and clean. We haven't smoothed anything out where things don't need to be smooth, but yet we still have a nice texture on the outside. All right, thank you and have a great day.